Hi, and welcome to Animalia, the podcast. I'm Natasha, and thank you so much for tuning in. On this episode of Animalia, I'm finally covering the subject of wildlife protection, which is one of the reasons for this podcast. I'm speaking with a man who's traveled the world defending the rights of animals to exist in their natural habitats. He's a criminologist by training, and he's put that knowledge to use here in Trinidad and Tobago to advance the cause of conservation and the fight against the trade in wildlife, which is so prevalent. He's American born, but Trinbago adjacent now. So please welcome to Animalia, Mr. Mark Gibson. I'd like to welcome to Animalia Mark Gibson, and he will tell you all about himself. He is, as you will detect from his accent, he's not from Trinidad. So let's start off first by telling us, Mark, what brought you to the shores of Trinidad and Tobago?
Yes, well, first, let me just say thank you for having me. I really appreciate that, Natasha. And yes, what has brought me to the shores of Trinidad and Tobago? Well, I am first and foremost a PhD researcher in criminology, and
Hmm.
I am a longtime crime investigator and almost as long conservationist, wildlife conservationist. And I work at the intersection of the two. And as part of my PhD research, I needed a place with a fairly substantial wildlife trade, illegal, harmful wildlife trade. And that is Trinidad and Tobago, I'm sorry to say.
Hmm.
But it's not much of a secret, I think, for people who live here. It's there's a lot of
Yes,
wild animals around.
indeed. Before we get into the work that you're doing in Trinidad and Tobago, tell me a little bit about your life growing up with animals and your interaction with animals in that context, domestic and wild, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I come from a family that just full of animal lovers, and grew up moving around a bit. So animals and nature are very much part of some of the most stable experiences of my childhood. I moved around every 4 years. It's probably a bad joke, but it's drugs and religion. My dad worked in pharmaceuticals, so not the drugs you're probably thinking.
Hmm.
And my mom is a minister, and so we moved around as both part of both careers. But my mom is a big animal lover. We grew up with dogs, actually horses for a time,
Hmm.
and I was a funny kid, I guess you could say. And at one point, I had a bunch of pet rats, which are really not
Oh, wow.
what people expect. So almost like a wild animal, but not quite. So
Well, not quite wild, not quite domestic either. People
no,
generally
no,
don't think of rats as pets, but
they're incredibly intelligent,
Hmm.
and if well cared for, especially from young, they're completely tame.
Hmm. Interesting. I wonder if there's any, but do you know of anybody in Trinidad and Tobago who owns rats as pets?
No, no, actually, I've
No.
never.
I figured not.
Yeah, and that's part of my research is trying to figure out what sort of animals are kept in private homes,
Mm,
and that people do keep them, but as food for their pet snakes.
right. Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah,
So let's get into the meat of why you're here and about the Nurture Nature campaign, which recently started, and how that dovetails into your research. Is it part of your research, and what were the objectives in terms of establishing a campaign like that?
yeah. It's I don't know if part of my research. but it's I guess partly a result of my research. I don't do direct research on the campaign, but the campaign builds off of the findings that have come out of my studies, and well, I guess in some ways by collaborating with many different NGOs, we've probably learned more than I would have just on my own as a solitary researcher. But most of all, I have worked for many years in conservation and nonprofit crime investigations. And I know that there's always this risk that when you do social science or any type of science, that it's it's research without a purpose, that you might come up with a great paper for an academic journal that most people will never read, let alone be able to access. And that's not really what I'm
Yeah.
about. So it was always part of the design of my research that I would want to find a way to try and contribute. And I had hoped it would turn into something like this, but this was always kind of the long shot, because it takes money to do a campaign,
Mm.
and we were very fortunate. As part of one of my qualifying exams, I wrote a grant proposal to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they liked the idea. They liked the idea of a social marketing campaign in Trinidad and Tobago to try something new, try to raise awareness, and that's where we are today. They approved it.
Perfect. When did it start?
Let's see. It's gone through a couple phases. You could say the first phase started October 2018, and that's when we went for
Mhm.
research. We wanted to establish a research base, and then
Yeah.
in January 2021, we launched the social marketing campaign. So it was public facing as of January 2021.
Right.
It was actually a bit delayed, but 2020 was a messy year,
Yes, it was for a lot of people. Yes, or for the
as was
world, I should say.
2021. But
Yes. Yes.
at some point, you just got to get going.
But that, I mean, that might have posed some interesting questions for you in terms of your research on how COVID has impacted the wildlife
Yeah,
trade and conservation in general.
yeah, yeah. It has. My Much of my research happened before the pandemic, so
Mm.
it's you just say my observations are fairly anecdotal. In fact, even I had to
Mm.
stop a bit of my research under university rules because of the pandemic. They don't want researchers contributing to spreading disease, which absolutely
Right.
makes sense.
Right. Makes
Um,
sense. Yeah.
but yeah, I think on the whole, it's been, unfortunately, the pandemic has had a very negative impact on wildlife,
Mm.
and I think primarily it's because so many people and so many, let's say, economic institutions exist that treat wildlife as this resource, that their value is instrumental, that it's what can I use this for, not this has intrinsic value and should stay in the forest. So pocketbooks shrinking, hungry mouths,
Hmm.
more animals get taken from the forest by hunters. And then uh, it's a little hard to say for sure, but I my guess is that we did see more animals come across from Venezuela because
Hmm.
I would assume that the economic impacts there were pretty severe.
Yes.
But then again, maybe it couldn't have gotten worse than it already was. But we believe that it's been pretty detrimental to wildlife. And then I'll just add, really all animals, wild and domestic, been very seriously impacted by the pandemic simply because less money in the household means less veterinary care, lower quality food, and animals have certainly suffered.
Yeah, and in the time that you've been here, I mean, you mentioned earlier about Trinidad being like a unique space for this kind of investigation. What do you make of how culture impacts on the wildlife trade and all of the issues that surround it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, well, I think Trinidad is in some ways not so unique because in as we find in many tropical places where you have higher rates of biodiversity, people living in closer proximity to biodiversity.
Hmm.
Well, in North America, you'd never be working your farm and see a monkey. You know,
Right.
that doesn't there you don't have that opportunity.
Yeah.
Here, you'll see a monkey, you'll see a parrot, and on and on. And so, I think there are these traditional cultural practices where many think it's all right to catch and eat. Many monkeys actually. Trinidad was once covered. There, as best as we can tell, the range of monkeys was across the island
Hmm.
once upon a time, and a lot of those monkeys were eaten. And parrots, we know, go back a long time, being kept as pets, and songbirds more recently, and we know that that's also driven many to near extinction, if not extinction, locally. So, like the red siskin is a bird that you can no longer find in Trinidad, and the blue and gold macaw was also fully removed and is only here today because of conservationists who brought it back. But I think, one thing that I do find very profound here in Trinidad is it reminds me of some more, well, let's say the traditional colonialism runs so deep that this was one of the first places, uh, well, visited by Columbus, right? So I'm using air quotes here, discovered, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Can't see my air quotes, but yeah, and you have centuries of exploitative economic institutions. So I think that's the strength of those institutions,
Hmm.
the corruption that's emerged from it. It does make conservation in this country uniquely difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. And what are some of the things then that, along with what you just mentioned, that you've learned doing your research and mounting this campaign? What kind of feedback have you got from members of the public about some of the issues that you've been raising?
I would say on the whole, it's been pretty positive. I've heard many times that in interviews, in focus groups, and in response to our social media education, our posts, our webinars, I'll hear from people who just say, "I did not know that." I think the one that probably the thing that's most gut wrenching for me are the people who keep monkeys and how few know until after they get the monkey that
They're not supposed to.
they're not supposed to, but that this is I can't imagine a worse way to get a companion animal because it means almost always the mother monkey has been killed.
Hmm.
And monkeys do not walk around on the ground for the most part. So when the hunter would shoot the mother, they're not really sure if they're going to miss the baby.
Hmm. Yeah.
um, and maybe they don't even care. They're just after the meat. Um, Maybe the baby doesn't survive the fall. And then it's kind of only if all that works out for the child that it would then get trafficked in horrible conditions.
Hmm.
Um, and then, it ends up in human hands and treated like a small child with diapers and loved on, at least for the few years before it becomes too aggressive. And
Hmm.
most people have no idea. They just say, "Oh, I just wanted a monkey. That sounded fun."
Yes, yes. And I have some personal experience with that in terms of a friend of mine saying to me that she would love to have a pet monkey. She has dogs, and she wanted a monkey. And I was like, but I don't think monkeys are pets, first of all. And I don't think you can
No.
procure one legally in Trinidad. I don't know that that's a thing. So I suppose from that perspective, and that question from her actually made me think. I wonder what the laws and the regulation is around persons owning wildlife as pets.
Mm-hmm. Uh, I mean, I can tell you, I have studied it a lot. I'll say one unfortunate thing is that the main conservation law, conservation of wildlife, two words, wildlife, just goes to show how old it is. Conservation of Wildlife Act of 1958. Um, most birds, mammals, and reptiles are considered protected animals under the law. That's a category assigned to it. But unfortunately, it means that it's a discretionary decision on the part of Forestry Division in Trinidad and what's called Department of Natural Resources and Forestry in Tobago. So they can decide who can have them. And you do have a lot of issues where, it's a friend of a friend and someone gets a permit. So that's generally. There is a policy in the last couple years in Trinidad that they don't authorize monkeys. But I have seen permits given as recent as 2018. And but there's other laws. There's an Animals Act. A lot of people don't know this. In the Animals Act, it actually says you cannot legally import monkeys.
Hmm.
So every non-native monkey is definitely smuggled
Right.
goods.
But why do you think that they would, as you said, you mentioned the law is very old, but why do you think it hasn't been updated to reflect, the common knowledge, I think, in conservation worldwide, that wild animals should remain wild? Why would they even issue permits for people to have
I think
pets, wild animals? But
you have a pretty yeah, you have a pretty influential hunting group or groups,
okay,
and
yeah,
it's hard.
mm,
I mean, moving beyond the pet animals, the hunting laws. I
right,
mean,
right,
you can't get more outdated than the laws that are on the books.
mm,
There aren't even bag limits, as they call them. So a hunter who is given a permit to hunt iguana can hunt literally
as
as
many
many
as
as they can get.
well. Do you think that may be partly because our forests and are not as protected as probably should be? That we haven't put the resources in place to protect the wildlife. So when it's the hunting season is open, it's just open, and
Yeah,
whatever happens, kind of thing.
illegal hunting. Yeah, open season, closed season. There's a lot of places that doesn't matter.
Right. I
And like in Northeast Tobago, some of the most protected animals, sea turtles. I've come across quite a few active poaching events. It just happens. It just happens, and there's no funding or resources to police it.
Hmm. That is extremely unfortunate. I mean, I can't, and I think I think generally um, our culture has been one that is very permissive because we're not very good at regulating things,
Mm,
and that leads to basically everybody doing what they want. You know, that's what they say. People just do what they want here, and if you get caught, you get caught. But you know, at the end of the day, you just have sort
yeah,
of free reign to do whatever.
there's a strong element of that. There's this illegal relativism
Mm,
that uh, I've heard. So one guy I interviewed down south who brought in a lot of illegal wildlife from South America. And I'm always amazed how many just tell me how many animals just die. So many
mm,
die. And
on the journey.
yeah, they don't, it's hard to take care of them. You know, the trafficking process is really rough on animals. You know, they might go a day or two without water. There's
Yeah.
salt spray, they're cramped, you know, they get sick. And yeah, but I'll ask, well, how do you justify this? And you know, I'll hear things like, well, I'm an animal lover, but you know, people die every day, so you know, this isn't that bad. Yeah,
Wow.
actually, yeah, most of the
Wow.
traffickers I've interviewed actually consider themselves animal lovers and pride themselves on being not like the other guys, that they can teach people how to properly take care of those animals.
Really? Well, that is cognitive dissonance at its finest. Wow.
Absolutely. It does also though leave me horrified to think that maybe there are the really bad guys that I've never been able to meet, and
Mm.
maybe they really just don't care.
So the the trade in and of itself is, it must be quite lucrative for people to risk being caught. I mean, I suppose what is the likelihood of people being caught doing this?
Oh, it's low. It's low.
Mm,
You know, I think I'll just watch my words here, but the traffickers that I've interviewed, the pet shop operators that I've interviewed, they allege that it's very corrupt.
mm,
Traffickers will say, you know, the real risk of losing a shipment is when I'm not paying off the Coast Guard, because they'll get upset and come and then set loose all the animals on a beach in South Trinidad.
right.
And that's, you know, or take the animals and sell them themselves.
Hmm.
Um, Same thing with police. There's even a former. I interviewed a pet shop operator run by a former police officer, and he was absolutely certain that even the members of police force in South were part of this. And so you might go to Icacos and buy birds, and then you'll be driving out, and the police will stop you and
Hmm.
arrest you and confiscate the birds.
Right.
And that's just part of the racket. Yeah.
Yep. I know that this topic may seem a little foreign to those listening because we when we think of the wildlife trade, we think of ivory and other animals
Mm.
that live in other places in other countries in the world. We don't think of this kind of trade at this level happening here. But what from your information are the most trafficked animals in Trinidad and Tobago?
A great question. Just pulling up some numbers. We actually did a household survey with Central Statistical Office. So it would be randomized across both Trinidad and Tobago, meaning that we can come up with some rough numbers. And I'm a very conservative, let's say, armchair economist. Technically, I am an economist. I have a master's in economics from Johns Hopkins. But so we have very, very conservative numbers. Um,
Mm.
Trafficked versus kept. I'll give some numbers here, but I'll say it's actually quite hard to say how many are trafficked because that's what you'd call a flow, and you would need to know how many are dying.
Yes.
We have rough idea of that, but it's easier to say how many are in captivity right now. So um, some rough statistics. If you were to say how many households in Trinidad and Tobago have a wild animal, that's about 1 in 7.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so,
That is pretty high.
yes, indeed. Let's see. So that would be um, just under at a very conservative number, about just under 100,000 wild animals, birds, mammals, reptiles, and vertebrates. But
Mm.
if you were to really, if you were to, that's an assumption of one animal of each species per household, which is totally not realistic.
No,
Most
but
people who
yes.
have parrots have two parrots, or many
Right.
do, and many people
Mm.
have many more than that. So, yeah, it's a very conservative number. But as it goes, some of the highest numbers, um, I would say the biggest would be green parrot, as everyone calls it. That's the
Mm.
orange wing Amazon,
Yep.
and let's see. Yeah, there would be around 32,000 at least in captivity.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. And um,
And that is a
another,
species that is native to Trinidad?
it is,
Right.
that is. But because the crisis in Venezuela and because of the historical poverty in Orinoco,
Mm.
most of those birds are still imported. Many of them still are.
Okay.
Um, so, like, you have a
That also
population of,
means, yeah, yeah, I was just gonna ask that. That means the local population must be severely diminished.
yes and no. I mean, it's funny. Like, as a very conservative estimate, we could say there's about 3,500 blue and gold macaws in captivity. But
Hmm.
as best we can tell, there's only about 100 in their native range. So they're protected. A lot are protected locally. And then you have other cases, the songbirds. You see all these men walking their birds. They have these cages. That's the
Yes.
songbird guys. And the main bird they keep now is what they call bullfinch,
Mhm.
um, chestnut-bellied seed finch, and there are over 10,000 in captivity by a conservative estimate. And those you actually really can't find in the wild anymore. And that is a situation they overtrapped, and now they do have to import. So you have a huge number of animals. I think maybe just to respond to a point you made earlier that you think wildlife trade, you usually think ivory or tigers or,
Mhm.
and you're right.
Mhm.
You're right. And I think it's a matter of who's trying to raise awareness. Most of the wildlife trade, I would say, is an animal welfare issue,
Yeah.
or is an invasive species issue, not conservation. I mean, the conservation, when it's an endangered animal, yes, that matters. But
Yeah.
Trinidad, actually, most of the volume is not in endangered animals globally. They might be endangered locally, but you sure as heck have almost all these animals suffering and dying so young.
Mhm.
And the green parrot, I think, is the best example. Most people in Trinidad and Tobago know someone who has a green parrot, and I would love, if anyone's listening to this, to go ask this person that you
Yeah.
might know how long they think an orange wing Amazon is supposed to live.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the wild, they're supposed to live about 50 years. And in captivity with a good diet, they're supposed to live up to 80 years.
Hmm.
And most people I meet, their bird is less than 10 years old,
Yep.
even if it looks old.
And on its last legs.
Yeah, it'll
Probably.
look real rough, and I'll be like, "Wow, is that an old parrot?" And they'll say, it is an old parrot." And I'm like, "Well, how old is old?" And they're like, "It's 10."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Well, that's what
Yeah.
10 years of complete malnutrition will do."
Yep. Wow. Apart from the work that you're doing, what are some of the other efforts that are being made, not necessarily by government, but by other organizations to raise awareness or
Mm.
to stem the tide of the trade? Is there anyone doing any similar work on this?
Uh, well, yes and no. I'll say Nurture Nature campaign is a broad coalition. We actually have 13 NGO coalition members.
Yes.
So we have some fantastic NGO partners. I'll highlight two that do a lot to raise
Yeah.
awareness.
Hmm.
Uh, El Socorro Center for Wildlife Conservation,
Yes.
and that's in Trinidad, and then Corbin Local Wildlife in Tobago. Both do wildlife rehabilitation, both do school education, outreach, have tours, and they have just core messages to that, these are not just food.
Hmm.
I think all
Yes.
of them, including myself, have heard some little kid joke that they wish they brought their pepper sauce.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's like, no, these are incredible animals. You don't want to just eat them, or maybe you don't want to
Mm,
eat them at all. So they do
correct.
incredible work. And then we do have some very politically active, what you might call dog and cat groups,
Mm,
TTSPCA, Society for Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals, uh, Animals 360, Animals Alive, um, Trinidad and Tobago Veterinary Association, the Associated Vet Student Group. And in the last couple of years, they've actually spearheaded a really great reform to the Animals Act for animal welfare rules. Now,
yes.
we're still waiting on the government to implement and set up an enforcement system. But you currently, as of last year, you have the first laws protecting the welfare of wild animals. And that didn't exist until June 2021.
Right. So we've
So they're
made
a great
some
group.
progress. Yeah.
Progress. It's the follow through with the
Mm,
government and having scarce resources,
yep.
and and a lot of political influence from people who aren't pro conservation. Um,
Mm,
Hunting bodies here, I would not say are not generally progressive, um,
yeah.
which they can be. I know that a lot of conservationists will say no, not ever, but like in my country, you have the fish and the I forget the term, but all the hunters and all the fishers, there are actually some very progressive hunting groups that say, no, we want these rules because we believe in hunting, but we want to have it so we can teach our children to hunt. And if there's
Mm,
nothing left, that won't happen. But I don't see that here. I haven't seen that.
right. Uh, Again, the animal welfare aspect of it is to me is paramount. Um,
Yeah.
Animal welfare for them, not just in captivity, but in the wild as well. I mean, both they're both equally important.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I'm my personal views. I do share. I usually use this as an opener. I would prefer that um, outside of fish. So I guess I'm a bit
mhm,
of a speciesist, but I don't believe in terrestrial hunting except to control overpopulation. But that's not, I'm not the guy in control. And this, I environmentalists don't get to rule the day, but we have to find common ground. But
Yes, somehow it's difficult. I know because, I mean, even in my own the process of doing this podcast, I have I'm making the transition from vegetarian to vegan because of what I've learned about the fishing industry and the dairy
yeah,
industry, and I'm still learning about what obtains here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think those kinds of or that kind of information helps people to make um, more, I want to say, ethical decisions about their activity and the food that they eat. So, in that vein, what do you think we as ordinary citizens, what can we do to assist the cause that you're championing?
right. Well, it might sound trite, but educate yourselves. I think it goes both ways. Conservationists, naturalists in this country know a lot about wild animals, but they don't really know
Mm,
about the dog and cat welfare issues. And so I often tell them, hey, learn about
right.
this, learn what the options are to control animal populations in a sound and ethical way. And the other way around is, dog and cat folks, learn about the wild animal issues because we need an informed community.
Yep.
I would like to say that in the next couple of years there will be movement to reform the Conservation of Wildlife Act. So that would be another great way to support it.
Yes.
And they are now reforming the permit system, so more of a regulatory reform than a legal. But it's showing steps. But I think supporting groups like Nurture Nature when we put out a call for action later this year, um, or just telling your political representatives, hey, this
Hmm.
this matters to me.
Yep. Agreed. And talking to people, as you mentioned earlier, and you know somebody who has a monkey or a parrot, just ask them if they're aware that, um, you are not only shortening the life of this wild animal, but you may be doing something illegal. So maybe you might want to, just have conversations. And I mean, I've heard in other um, in other places that animal welfare is as much about humans as it is about animals. So it's important for us to talk to each other about these things.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you so much, Mark, for your time and for agreeing to be on Animalia. I've started the year off pretty well with two men because I had that issue last time around last season. I only had women, so it's good to have men on board because we know that this community of animal welfare activists is mostly women, right? I think there's a reason for that, but that's
yeah.
another conversation. So, but thank you so much for your time,
Got
and
it.
we will
Yes.
share your rescue me a little later on in this podcast.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on and helping share another voice in this community. I know as a criminologist, I'm not, I can, I can make for exciting but kind of depressing dinner conversation. um, but I do think it's important to point out, there are reasons to hope for better, and
Yeah.
progress is being made, and you do see movement even elsewhere in the Southern Caribbean. Um, Guyana, for instance, has now banned the keeping of all monkeys and is going to be very aggressive on policing that. That's something that Trinidad could do, right?
Yep.
So I,
Absolutely.
I look forward to a better tomorrow.
Indeed. Thank you for ending us on that very hopeful note. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I am so happy for this conversation with Mark because, when we talk about animal welfare, we don't often include wildlife, but they are just as important, perhaps more so, to overall environmental awareness and conservation of our natural resources. I hope this interview was able to expand all of our minds to understand the role that wild animals, whether birds, reptiles, or mammals, play in maintaining a healthy ecosystem. This week's Rescue Me is a sweet kitten called Precious, who's currently being housed at Animals Alive. Here's Mark to tell us all about her.
This is Precious. She was rescued as a kitten along with her siblings. She's everything you need to make your gloomy days brighter. With her charming personality and loving nature, she's sure to steal your heart at first purr. She loves an adventure, she's inquisitive and playful, and she makes each day that goes by full of sunshine. Our trusty friends at Animals Alive have been keeping Precious warm and safe. And luckily for us, she is definitely ready to find her forever home. So you can contact Animals Alive at animals.alivettt on Instagram. They also have a Facebook page, or you can contact them by WhatsApp at 709-1151.
And that's the end of episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll be back in 2 weeks to hear another amazing person doing their part to advance the cause of animal welfare. Remember to check out the website animaliathepod.com for new episodes, archived episodes, and much more. Search and subscribe to Animalia the Pod on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or YouTube for new episodes. And you should also like and follow Animalia the Pod on Facebook and Instagram. And if you'd like to appear on the podcast, send an email to animaliathepod@gmail.com. I'm Natasha, and until next time, take good care and remember, love off your pets. Bye-bye.
Wash away the wrong, wash away the wrong, wash away the weak, wash away the weak, wash away the strong. Hang on, baby, float along. Don't try to fight it, don't try to fight it.